As we continue our study of ecology in this final unit of Bio 213, we now arrive at the concept of communities and how all of the members of a community that live in the same place are going to be interacting with one another. In my opening slide, you can see a picture of a forest, most definitely a tropical rainforest based on the plants you can see. And while it is a beautiful, almost mystical, mysterious type of place, it is also full of surprising interactions. Some of the members of a community are going to be helping each other. Other members of the community are going to be feeding on plants. We call those herbivores. There are going to be also those that feed on the plant eaters, the carnivores, that are going to be the decomposers that live in the soil. And at different times, some people may have almost like a negative feeling towards the role of a community member, like a predator. And they think that predators are evil because they eat other things, or they may think that decomposers are disgusting because of the dead organic material they're feeding on. I'm hoping that this presentation of communities can help eliminate some of those ideas people may have, and actually help you think about how valuable and how important every member of the community is going to be. So one of the first things that we need to do is identify the properties that define a community. Previously, for example, when you looked at populations, you may recall learning that populations can be defined based on the demographic structure of the population. You may, for example, remember populations can be described in terms of density, how the members of the population are spread out in one area, maybe clustered or clumped, sometimes maybe more evenly spread or distributed. Communities, likewise, are going to have their own characteristics we can use for describing them and also for setting them. So keep in mind that a community is going to be all of the populations, all the living organisms sharing one common place, one common area. But we are limited only to living things. Non-living things, those are going to be part of the next hierarchical level of life, which is going to be ecosystems. But when you look at communities, one of the characteristics you want to look at is going to be diversity. Diversity refers to the variety of species, how many different kinds of species are present in a community. And there are two common measures of this diversity. One of those is going to be species richness. In a species richness, all you have to do is focus on a subsection of the community. For example, you may look at the community of trees, and that is, a valid way of looking at a community. And you can go and look at one area, one park, or a designated space where you're doing a study, and count all the different species of trees that are present in that place. If you can do that, then you're coming up with the species richness for the trees, that total number of species that are present. And if we look at this illustration that I have here, you can see that there are two communities that are identified as Community 1 and Community 2. And to make things easy, you can see that in Community 1, there are 4 different kinds of trees. We can see that the species richness for Community 1 is 4. That's the richness, total number. And if you come over here to Community 2, you can count the different kinds of trees. There's this type, that's 1. There's this other type here, that's 2. There's this other type here, that's 3. And here's one more, that's 4. It may seem that the two communities, 1 and 2, have the same level of diversity. They do have the same richness. Both have a total of 4 different trees present in the place. But where these two communities are going to be different is with regards to the relative abundance. If you can count here for the trees that are on community number 1, there's going to be the same number of trees. There are 5 trees for species A, 5 trees for B, 5 for C, and 5 for D. However, if you look at community 2, you're going to see that most of the trees in this place are going to be this species A. There's going to be only one of these trees for species C, and there's going to be one of these trees for species B, and there's only two of the trees identified as species D. And so because most of the trees are just of one type, this community is not even. And that is a word that doesn't appear here, and may seem to you like I'm making it up, but believe me, I am not. It's a word that we use in ecology. And maybe I can switch to my pen. And so the word is described as evenness. And we can say that community number one has more evenness because each member of the community of trees is going to have an equal representation in the entire community. Whereas community number two doesn't have the same evenness. You can say it has lower evenness because we only have one of these types of trees and because we only have only one of these kinds of trees over here. Now, why does this matter? It matters a great deal because on Earth, things are changing all the time, and certainly within communities, there are going to be changes. Think, for example, about a situation where there's like this bad beetle, and you've heard the news recently in ecology about how insects can be very destructive to a forest. And let's say that this beetle is coming from this direction over to the community. It's present over here. Now it settles into these trees and destroys this tree, destroys this tree, destroys this tree, and destroys these trees. So these trees now have been destroyed by this type of an insect, a beetle. What will be the richness of community one after this change? Well, it's still going to be a richness of 4 because of the evenness. This community number one is going to be more resistant to changes. Someone of one of the species of trees will have a chance of surviving if they are not alone in the community. Now take a look at community number 2. And now let's say that the change that happened in this other community is a fire. So flames came and destroyed the prairie, all of the grass on this side of the community. And because of the fire, before it could be stopped, it destroyed this tree. This one also burned up. This one also burned up. And this tree also now has disappeared. So all of these trees now are gone. This type of tree we had here was the only one of its kind. And now if you count the number of trees that are still surviving, you're going to find that there's only 3 different species. The richness of the community went down from 4 down to 3. And that happened because of the lower evenness of this community. So that's, 2 different ways you can look at diversity. You can look at the total number of species, but you can also look at the evenness or relative abundance. One thing we can say for sure is that in ecology, we want communities to be as diverse as they can because they are going to be much more productive. There's going to be more resources. Even some of the members of the community that are not as abundant are going to be relying on. And so productivity is greater in a diverse community. Also, stability. They're going to be less resistant to change. Think about the examples I just showed to you, what a fire can do, what a new pest, like a beetle, an insect, can do to a forest. Also, they are better able to recover from environmental stresses. After the fire goes away, if you have trees, even though a few of one type surviving, their seeds can go and repopulate those areas where trees have been destroyed. And they're also going to be more resistant to invasive species. Invasive species are a problem because whenever you take one species out of their original place and you bring them to a new location, sometimes there are no natural predators or biological control for those species move to the new place. We call them invasive because they have a tendency to take over everything, use up all the resources. You can think about those Himalayan blackberries that are all over the Puget Sound area, and what a problem they can be for other native plants, including many of the native wildflowers in the state. Where those Himalayan blackberries are present, they pretty much take over the entire area. Another characteristic of communities is going to be the nature of the dominant species. So when you go to one place, inevitably there's going to be one type of organism that seems to stand out more. That is usually going to be plants. In terrestrial, what I mean by terrestrial is land communities, plants. And so when you think about a place like the one in this picture here, you see all the grasses. This type of community will be named a grassland community. And there are not only grasses, but maybe some other herbs and some other annual plants mixed in there, but the majority of the members of the community will be grasses. You can see a few trees, maybe a few shrubs in the background as well. What if the dominant organisms are trees, meaning that most of the members of the community are trees? Then you call that community a forest. And we have all different kinds of forests around the world. We have the tropical rainforest, we have tropical dry forests, we have the temperate rainforest, we have the deciduous temperate forests. We have so many different types of places where trees are going to be the dominant members of the community. What if you go to an aquatic type of environment? Then in those cases, it may be something like kelp. Kelp is a producer, it's a type of algae that uses inorganic carbon dioxide dissolved in the water with light, so it can make go through the process of photosynthesis to make glucose and food, not only for themselves, but also for other organisms that depend on kelp. Another type of a dominant member of a community is going to be corals. Now, corals are going to be animals. They are not producers, but corals can actually take microscopic algae, and as they eat them and incorporate that energy into their bodies, they themselves become the source of food for many other types of fish that live in the ocean. And so because of that important step of collecting algae, microscopic algae, and then ingesting it, and then making that energy available to the next level, corals are going to be dominant species in some places. We can also look at some members of a community that are not going to be necessarily the most abundant, the most numerous, but they're actually going to be in smaller numbers, yet despite their low density, some species can actually have a very strong effect on the diversity of the community. When that is the case, you're looking at a keystone species. Keystone species can be sometimes, in many cases, can be a predator. For example, this week you are looking at the case of wolves in Yellowstone Park. That is a keystone predator. Jaguars in a tropical rainforest, like what happened in Venezuela over there at Lake Erie, that's a top predator. And these top predators is one of those examples of what I said at the beginning of my presentation. Many people think they are evil, ruthless, vicious predators, but in reality, what they do is they help keep under control other species that are also present in the community, that if you leave them unchecked, meaning if you just let those other species do whatever they want to do, they can take over an area, they can become more abundant and take more of the resources than they should be allocated to have. Take a look, for example, at this animal here in the picture, which is the ochre sea star. And this is the result of a classic study in ecology where in the 1960s, most ecologists used to think that the diversity of a community was regulated by the producers, by the members that are using photosynthesis to make food for everything else. But Bob Payne from the University of Washington, one of our neighbor institutions, doing studies in the Olympic Peninsula with these animals, the ochre sea stars. He removed them from one pool at the edge of the ocean, we have rocky shores in the Olympic Peninsula, and he removed all of the sea stars from some of the pools, put them in another part of the bay, and then watch to see what happened in those places where this predator had been removed. The sea star is a predator. They have this unusual feeding behavior where the stomach actually comes out of the body, wraps around that thing that they're trying to eat, and what sea stars are looking for in terms of food is going to be mussels. It's a type of a mollusk, a bivalve. They have a two-part shell. I'm sure you know what mussels I'm talking about, not the kind in your arms or your legs. And so sea stars eat mussels. They also eat barnacles and a few other organisms which have a tendency for their populations to explode and just take over an entire area. And so look what happened as a consequence of these classic studies. If the sea star is removed, the number of species present is significantly reduced. This is data coming from Bob Payne's classic study in the 1960s. However, in pools of water, the rocky shore where these sea stars live, and the numbers were kept high, the number of species present not only stayed steady, but seems to have increased a little bit over time. And so what the sea stars are doing is that they're eating these mussels and they're eating barnacles and other species, keeping the density of mussels and barnacles at low density, controlling the numbers of those individuals in those populations. In doing so, they're allowing for areas of rock to be occupied by algae and other types of mollusks that depend on an area. Take out the sea star, and then what happens? The mussels take over. They position themselves on every surface imaginable on the rocks. Barnacles can do the same thing. And by taking the entire surface of the rocks, they prevent other species from living in the same place. And that's how species richness will go down if you remove a top predator. In some cases, keystone species can also be herbivores. And there are other studies that have been done with snails, with elephants in Africa. It's considered to be a type of a keystone predator because even though elephants are not really abundant, numerous, their presence helps preserve the diversity of the savannas where elephants live. And this is just another picture showing what happens with a keystone predator. In this case, we're looking at sea otters. They have the wrong picture. I don't know if you know your animals here. They actually have the picture of a river otter. Don't ask me what happened here. Editors didn't catch the problem. But this is supposed it's a sea otter. Sea otters like to feed on sea urchins, and sea urchins like to feed on the holdfast. If you remember when we studied about kelp, it's a type of brown alga. They attach to rocks or the bottom of the ocean using something that looks like a root, but it is not a root. It's called the holdfast. And the problem with the sea stars is if they eat the holdfast of kelp, now the plant, I'm sorry, not a plant, it's an alga. The alga is not anchored, the kelp is not anchored anymore, and it floats, and when it floats to the surface of the water, it washes up ashore, where sometimes you can see kelp that has washed that stinky mess, not really doing the purpose it's supposed to be doing of making food for those animals like fish that live underwater. And so what happens if you remove this predator, the sea otter, is that the population of sea urchins will go up. And when the population of sea urchins goes up, look what happens. The density of kelp declines. If we have large numbers of sea otters, then the population of sea urchins is low, and the number of kelp, the density of kelp, stays high, which is ideal for a kelp forest type of community. And so you can see again the example of how important these animals can be. They're not as numerous as the mollusks or the birds that live near the shore of the ocean. But because of their small numbers, but the important work that they do, they're going to be considered keystone species, keystone predators. One more characteristic of communities that I wanted to mention to you is the trophic structure. And trophic structure is going to be describing the role, the trophic level, meaning the feeding level. Trophic means food or feeding. Some members of the community will be producers. They feed themselves, but they also make food for other members of the community. Consumers, these are going to be known as heterotrophs because they have to eat something else to obtain energy. We also have the decomposers, like we've learned about the important role of fungi as decomposers and bacteria that live in the soil as decomposers. And what we want to do is we want to see how these members of the community can move energy from one level to another using graphic descriptions like a food chain. And I'm going to show that to you in the next slide. But before I move on, I want to say something. The idea that I put in your minds from the beginning of my presentation, that there's no bad member of the community. If a member of a community is removed, everyone else is going to be suffering. If the decomposers go away, the producers don't have enough materials to make food for the consumers. If the consumers like predators go away, well, I already told you what happens when you remove the top predators from a place. The producer density is going to go down, and the decomposers soon may have nothing really to decompose anymore. So all of the members of a community have an important role to play. They're an important part of the diversity of the community. And how we can show the energy flow can be with these food chains. You can see a terrestrial food chain where a plant, like a wildflower, provides food for an insect, the herbivore, which feeds on the plant. That's also known as a primary consumer because it feeds on the primary producer. Then this insect can be eaten by a carnivore, like this rodent you see here. That's going to be a secondary consumer because it feeds on the primary consumer. And the arrows here showing the flow of energy. Energy goes from the plant and goes into the body of this insect. From the body of the insect, energy goes into the body of the rodent. This carnivore can be eaten by another higher level carnivore, like a rattlesnake. And the rattlesnake will be a tertiary consumer because it's feeding on a secondary consumer. Usually food chains end right about here at the tertiary consumer, but in some cases you may see food chains with a quaternary consumer. That's going to be like as high as you can go in terms of consumers in a community, and these are going to be absolutely top predators. Here on the marine food chain, you can see that from phytoplankton like algae, zooplankton will be the primary consumers. Carnivores like fish feeding on zooplankton can be food for other fish, for other carnivores, and eventually be consumed by a top predator such as a killer whale or orcas, as we also know them in the Puget Sound area. A better way of showing the dynamics of how energy flows in a community is going to be intermixing all of the different food chains and making them into a food web. The important information we can get from a food web is that, for example, something like krill, which is a type of a crustacean, so important for a marine food chain, can be food for some form of carnivorous plankton, but it can also be food to birds, and there are going to be whales that feed on krill. So krill, if you just look at it in a food chain, may seem like they're only providing energy for one type of an organism, but in reality, these are going to be feeding many different things. Something like carnivorous plankton sometimes can be a consumer, but sometimes it's going to be the thing that is providing food for another level of energy. In this case here, the carnivorous plankton is going to be providing food for a secondary consumer. This will be the primary consumer. If you go from here, from phytoplankton, and you count the arrows and steps up, you can see that the carnivorous plankton can be sometimes secondary consumer. If the carnivorous plankton then provides food for the squid, what would be the level of consumer for a squid? Let's think about that question. So the energy flows from phytoplankton to copepods, primary consumer, to the carnivorous plankton, secondary consumer. Then the squid will be a tertiary consumer. So as you count the steps of how arrows are moving, that's what will help you know what would be the level in the trophic structure of a community, the level for one of these members of the community. And I'm going to end this presentation over here and make one more presentation or one more characteristic of communities, and that is going to be stability and ecological succession.